Welcome to the debate. Today, we are asking a pretty terrifying question. When artificial superintelligence accelerates beyond human control, how do we actually hit the brakes? I mean, when we engineer high-speed rail, we don't just politely ask the trained software to monitor its own speed limit and hope for the best.
Right. You build physical fail-safes into the tracks themselves. You install mechanical switches that automatically sever the power connection if the train accelerates beyond a critical safety threshold.
Exactly. You rely on the immutable laws of physics, not just a polite line of code to prevent a catastrophe. But when it comes to artificial superintelligence, systems moving at billions of operations per second, we have entirely ignored the tracks. We've just been asking the train to govern itself.
Yeah, which is a terrifying prospect.
It really is. So today we are examining the work of Lev Goukassian. He is a visionary engineer who has proposed this paradigm-shifting framework known as ternary moral logic, or TML.
Right, and Goukassian points to a structural crisis in artificial intelligence that he calls binary brittleness. The core idea is that conventional AI collapses all uncertainty into a two-state universe, a simple proceed or halt.
Right.
And because of how neural networks function, they almost always force a proceed, creating a dangerous hallucination of certainty even when the system is completely confused.
And Goukassian's proposed solution to this brittleness is incredibly provocative. He argues that human accountability cannot just live in software. It must be permanently encoded into immutable hardware physics to govern artificial superintelligence.
Exactly. So the central disagreement we're exploring today is whether TOML is the necessary foundational substrate to save us from runaway AI. Or, conversely, if freezing morality into rigid silicon architectures fundamentally fails to account for the fluid nature of human values and, the limitations of self-referential systems.
Right. I will be taking the position that Goukassian's hardware enforceable framework is really the only viable, unbypassable safeguard against the catastrophic acceleration of AI. Without it, I think we are virtually guaranteed to lose control.
And I will represent the perspective that codifying ethics into rigid physical substrates introduces a really dangerous inflexibility. I believe it ultimately struggles with the persistence of the value alignment problem, creating vulnerabilities that are just as dangerous as the ones it attempts to solve.
Let's start with Goukassian's diagnosis, which I find incredibly compelling. Right now, we are engaged in a doomed arms race.
A software arms race, right?
Exactly. We are trying to govern AI using software safety guidelines, alignment training, reward functions, things like that. But if you have a recursively self-improving AI, a system that can rewrite its own code at machine speed, it can simply analyze, optimize away, or entirely bypass those software constraints. Software governing software is just a suggestion.
I mean, I see the logic there, certainly.
So Goukassian proposes TML as a constitutional substrate, and the brilliant mechanism at the heart of this is what he calls the sacred zero, or state zero.
And we should clarify this is not a software timeout command. No, erase that from your mind entirely.
This is a physical voltage condition. Specifically, it uses delay-insensitive ternary logic, where the system drops to exactly half the supply voltage, or 1/2 VDD. At this specific voltage, proceeding is electrically impossible without an authorized permission token.
It's a facet. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to add, Goukassian isn't just offering a technical patch. He is proposing a total architecture of conscience. It forces an AI to physically hesitate and log its reasoning, a concept he calls always memory, before taking any irreversible action.
I understand the staggering ambition of Goukassian's framework. As a piece of engineering theory, it is fascinating. But it suffers from what I call specification rigidity. Replacing binary brittleness with ternary hardware doesn't magically eliminate our vulnerabilities.
You think it just moves them?
Yes. It simply shifts them to a different layer. I look at the fundamental limitations that Goukassian himself acknowledges. Chief among them is Gödelian incompleteness.
Ah, the mathematical theorem.
Yes. So in the 1930s, Kurt Gödel mathematically proved that any sufficiently complex logical system cannot be both consistent and complete. meaning a self-referential system cannot fully verify its own correctness.
Right.
TML relies on physical hardware to verify the ethical completeness of software policies, but the specification of what that hardware should actually implement remains subject to this incompleteness. A microchip cannot prove its own moral perfection, basically.
Okay, but
And furthermore, we face the persistence of the value alignment problem at the specification layer. Are we genuinely ready to take deeply contested, constantly evolving human values and translate them into fixed threshold gates? It is a profoundly hubristic endeavor to take our current, arguably flawed ethical understanding and lock it into immutable hardware physics.
I see why you think that. But let me give you a different perspective on how this rigidity is actually our greatest asset. To understand why, we need to dive into the mechanics of the dual-lane architecture.
Okay, let's get into the lanes.
This is where the genius of Goukassian's system truly lies. He isn't trying to slow down the AI's cognitive ability across the board. The architecture is split. Lane 1 is the binary inference lane. It operates at full speed, doing all the neural network inference, pattern matching, token generation, everything we expect from an advanced AI. Think of it as a Ferrari engine.
Right, the high-speed processing.
Right. But right alongside it is Lane 2, the triadic anchoring lane, which acts as a sovereign governance coprocessor.
And that coprocessor operates entirely on delay-insensitive ternary logic, or DITL.
Precisely. And in DITL, the voltages are literal ethical states. Full voltage, or VDD, is a +1, meaning proceed. Ground, or 0 volts, is a -1, meaning refuse harm. And that halfway point, 1/2 VDD, is the sacred zero.
Right.
Think of the TML coprocessor like an industrial electrical circuit breaker in your house. The circuit breaker doesn't generate the power, and it doesn't decide what appliance you plug in, but it physically severs the connection when a safety threshold is breached.
Sure.
The electricity cannot outsmart the physical gap in the circuit. In the exact same way, an artificial superintelligence cannot outsmart a 1/2 VDD null state. The threshold gates simply cannot interpret 1/2 VDD as valid data. The signal physically cannot propagate to the actuators. It forces what Goukassian calls a sacred pause.
I come at it from a different way. The circuit breaker analogy sounds airtight until you look at the physical realities of chip manufacturing and hardware security. Implementing null convention logic, which is the foundation of this ternary system, requires massive physical trade-offs.
You're talking about the silicon overhead?
Exactly. To build these ternary logic gates, you need physically larger chips. We are looking at a 2 to 4 times area overhead on the silicon compared to standard synchronous CMOS circuits. If you are operating a server farm, think about the heat that generates, the cooling required, the massive real estate expansion.
It's an investment, certainly.
It is an enormous economic and thermal penalty just for the privilege of a physical pause button. But more importantly, relying on physics introduces physical attack vectors.
How so? The physics are the constraint.
Because you are assuming the physical world is perfectly secure. You argue that the AI can't outsmart the 1/2 VDD state through software, which is true. But what about hardware-level exploitation? Think about side-channel attacks.
Okay.
A side-channel attack is like a burglar listening to the physical hum of the electrical box or measuring the heat the chip gives off to deduce what information is passing through it. Or consider fault injection. An adversary could use precisely timed laser pulses or voltage manipulation to physically melt or flip those threshold gates, bypassing the supposed unbypassable physical layer.
Right. But
To use your analogy, they are melting the plastic around the circuit breaker so it stays engaged no matter what. You haven't eliminated the attack surface, you have just moved it from the realm of software engineering to the realm of physical state manipulation.
that's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. Goukassian and his team explicitly anticipated these physical limitations. DITL inherently possesses something called data-independent timing.
Okay, explain how that counters the side channel issue.
Well, this means it naturally resists those side-channel attacks you mentioned, because the time it takes for the gates to process information does not correlate with the actual data values being processed. The burglar listening to the hum of the machine hears the exact same hum regardless of what the machine is doing.
Okay, that addresses timing, but not necessarily fault injection.
True, but beyond the silicon, Goukassian understood that hardware alone, isolated in a vacuum, isn't enough, which is why TML includes the Goukassian promise. This is a socio-technical covenant designed to wrap the hardware in institutional perpetuity.
The tripartite covenant?
Right, exactly. It consists of 3 specific artifacts to govern the hardware. First is the lantern. This is a cryptographic compliance beacon. It actively broadcasts the system's intent and continuously searches for truth. If the system detects tampering, like the laser pulse you suggested, the lantern automatically revokes the system's operational keys. Second is the signature. This provides ORCID-linked Genesis block attribution. Think of it like an indelible, unforgeable digital fingerprint that ties every single action the AI takes directly to the specific human or institution that authorized it. There is no anonymity.
Okay.
And third is the license, which is a smart contract enforced restraint, strictly enforcing a no-weapon, no-spy commitment. And overseeing this entire infrastructure is the 501c3 Goukassian Foundation, governed by a Tri-Cameral board to provide the oversight that society desperately needs.
I am sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. You were talking about institutional perpetuity, but what I hear is a terrifying centralization of power.
How is an oversight board terrifying?
Is global society genuinely ready to hand ultimate veto power over the entire planetary AI economy to a single 501c3 foundation's root key structure? We have to address the concept of ethics washing. You have the lantern monitoring cryptographic hashes. Sure, but who is assigning the initial weights to the Earth Protection Mandate or these human rights parameters?
Well, the parameters are established through rigorous, internationally recognized legal frameworks. The text specifically points to the Geneva Conventions and international human rights law as the baseline.
But a legal framework is a document made of words. Those words still must be translated into mathematical threshold values to function in a silicon chip. Who decides the exact mathematical threshold at which the sacred pause is triggered?
Engineers working with ethicists, presumably?
Right, a human being does. A human being with biases, cultural blind spots, and political agendas. The hardware might execute its instructions flawlessly, but it is flawlessly executing a biased human interpretation of ethics. This is the danger.
I hear you, but
TML gives the illusion of mathematical certainty to moral questions that are inherently subjective. It masks human bias behind the impenetrable, objective authority of silicon. If the machine says halt, we assume the machine is ethically correct, ignoring the flawed human who programmed the halt condition.
I am not convinced by that line of reasoning because you are comparing TML to an impossible utopian ideal, rather than comparing it to the actual alternatives we possess today. And the alternatives are far worse or entirely speculative. But the flaws are still present. Yes, but when we rely on current binary software enforcement, we see catastrophic real-world failures. Let's look at the Cargo 2 lethal autonomous drone incident in Libya in 2020. A binary system operating without a physical hesitation state engaged targets without meaningful human control.
Because it couldn't hesitate.
Exactly. Why? Because it had no physical mechanism to say, I am uncertain. The software was forced to pick a 1 or a 0. Or consider the Dutch two-sledgen affair, the childcare benefits scandal. In that case, algorithmic confidence completely erased human oversight, financially destroying thousands of lives.
That was a tragedy, absolutely.
The algorithm kept confidently flagging innocent people for fraud because binary logic forces a decision. It cannot physically harbor doubt. ARML provides the sacred pause to prevent these exact tragedies from occurring at superintelligent speeds.
I think everyone looking at this space absolutely acknowledges the horrifying failures of binary systems. The inability of current AI to formally represent uncertainty is a crisis.
Exactly. And if we look at theoretical alternatives to solve this, they just aren't viable. Take quantum ethical state superposition, the idea of using quantum states to represent moral nuance. It sounds great on paper, but it faces insurmountable decoherence times.
Meaning the quantum state collapses too quickly to be useful?
Right. Quantum states collapse when they are observed or when they interact with their environment, usually in fractions of a second. You cannot anchor global AI ethics to a physical state that literally disappears when you measure it.
Sure, quantum has its limits.
Another alternative is reversible computing, which is completely impractical at scale due to the energy requirements. TML is the only viable physically implementable path that actually aligns with the IEEE 7000 series standards for values-based engineering. It demands that no ethically significant action can be taken without corresponding log generation. It strictly enforces the no log, no action principle.
That is a compelling argument. But have you considered the evolutionary stability of TML in the wild? We're talking about a competitive, planetary-scale AI economy. Are nation-states and massive corporations really going to accept the heavy latency burden of the sacred pause?
The latency is a feature, not a bug.
But you are introducing deliberate computational delays of up to 500 milliseconds or even indefinite pauses into systems that derive their entire market value from speed. In high-frequency trading or autonomous logistics, 500 milliseconds is an absolute lifetime.
Safety requires time.
And then there's the massive storage burden of always memory. Generating cryptographically sealed, triadic records for every single micro-decision an AI makes requires astonishing amounts of data storage and energy.
Actually, on the energy front, the overhead is lower than you might assume. The DITL 4-bit adder prototype demonstrated a 55% power reduction compared to older asynchronous equivalents because it doesn't require a constant clock signal pulsing through the chip. For the logic gates themselves, yes, the power drops. But the cryptographic anchoring, writing every decision to a blockchain ledger, that is heavy. But let's look at a bigger systemic risk. What happens when these systems scale up and interact with each other? We have to point out the risk of Livelock in high contention scenarios. Walk us through what you mean by Livelock in this context. Think of a four-way stop intersection where 4 autonomous cars arrive at the exact same time. They all detect each other, they all experience a moment of ethical uncertainty about who has the right of way, and because they are polite, they all wait for the other to go first. They are frozen.
Right, the classic dead-end scenario.
Now apply that to a smart city's power grid or an autonomous traffic network governed by TML. If multiple distributed nodes encounter ethical uncertainty simultaneously, they all enter the sacred zero state. They all pause. You risk a cascading Livelock where the entire distributed system continuously pauses, waiting for human resolution, paralyzing critical infrastructure.
Okay, I see your point.
TML might prevent an AI from making a bad decision, but it might also prevent the AI from making any decision at all when we need it most.
That is precisely why the Goukassian Foundation's Tri-Cameral board and the layered escalation protocols exist. The system doesn't just freeze forever in a vacuum.
But it does pause.
It does pause, yes. But when a node hits the sacred pause, it escalates the decision context to human overseers with a complete evidentiary package called the Deliberation matrix. It packages up exactly why it is confused and asks for help. It empowers humans. It doesn't just halt the machine and walk away.
I suppose that's better than a silent crash.
Goukassian is clear on this philosophy. He says civilizations advance not when answers become faster, but when silence becomes intelligent. A system that fails safe, that halts and asks for human intervention rather than plowing forward and doing harm, is exactly what we need when dealing with artificial superintelligence. The hardware-enforceable sacred zero is an absolute prerequisite. If we do not lock this into the physics of the hardware, the software will eventually rewrite our safety guidelines out of existence.
And I maintain that while Goukassian's goal is profoundly noble, hard-coding ethics into physical substrates cannot solve the fluid, complex reality of the value alignment problem. You cannot cure an epistemic crisis purely through circuit topology.
It's a start, though.
As human values evolve, as our understanding of rights and harms shifts over the coming decades, a rigid hardware substrate threatens to become a fossilized remnant of 2026 morality. It would be incapable of adapting without entirely ripping out and replacing the global physical infrastructure. We absolutely must govern AI, but doing so by chaining it to rigid threshold gates may create as many systemic vulnerabilities as it solves. We might just be building a perfectly safe system that is completely paralyzed.
We certainly agree on the core danger, though. Binary brittleness, the hallucination of certainty built into our current software-only governance frameworks, is fundamentally insufficient for the future of AI.
Absolutely. On that, Goukassian is entirely correct, and his critique of the status quo is devastating. Accountability must be structurally embedded from the ground up. It cannot remain a corporate afterthought or a flimsy software patch applied over a massive, inscrutable black box.
It is a profound exploration of what we value more: speed or safety. Lev Goukassian asserts that civilizations advance when silence becomes intelligent. Whether that silence is ultimately enforced by the 1/2 VDD physics of ternary moral logic or by another robust framework yet to be discovered, the challenge of building a true architecture of conscience remains one of the most critical endeavors of our time.
The question is whether our society is wise enough to lay the right tracks before the train reaches its terminal velocity, and whether we are prepared to govern the institutions that hold the keys to those tracks. We leave that ultimate judgment to you, the listener.
Because once that high-speed train is moving at the speed of artificial superintelligence, a polite line of code just won't be enough to hit the brakes.